I know some of you guys are going to accuse me of beating this topic to death, but honestly, the cam and lifter failure, epidemic, fiasco, whatever you want to call it, is like one of the biggest challenges the average guy, the average engine guy, or even just a hobbyist that wants to hop up his car and change the cam. It's one of the biggest problems that we're facing today. And I don't think you can really cover this enough, because it's enough to put a guy building his first engine out of the hobby. It's enough to put a business out of business a couple of times. You get hit with this a couple of times and you've got to redo an entire engine because it ate a cam. It can put a hurting on you. Two things happened over the weekend to make me come back and revisit the subject today. And the first is that I helped a friend of mine do a 318. We built a 318 in here. And the cam, I wanted to make sure the cam was going to be good. So before we even put it in the car, before we put it in the engine, so I cracked open a micrometer and I measured each lobe for lift. Now, the cam, wait, I tell you what, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the other thing. I caught a video over the weekend by a fellow YouTuber named My Vintage Iron 7512. And this guy's done a lot of really good videos, and he's done a couple of videos on this topic in the past. But he put one out this weekend that confirms pretty much what I had found on my own, but without the testing. He actually went and tested cams. So this guy is an engine builder and a machinist. And in the last year, he's had like half a dozen cams go bad on him. Could you imagine that? You imagine you're in this business and you have like half a dozen cams go bad? So he took action rather than speculating and so on and so forth. What he did was he got one cam from, or at least one cam, from each of the manufacturers and tested them for hardness. And he did the same thing with lifters. And what he found was that the rumors or the speculation that the cams might be soft or the lifters might be soft are false. They Rockwell tested each of these cams, and they also Rockwell tested lifters and found that, and even failed ones, they Rockwell tested failed ones as well. So for people who aren't familiar, Rockwell test is how you test the hardness of a metal. And the result after testing these cams from each of the manufacturers and these lifters, different batches of lifters, and he says, hundreds of lifters, they found that there was no deficiency in hardness, that they were all within the range that they should be for the application, which leads to only two possible failure points. One being oil, and we'll talk about it at the end of this video, but the other being machining practices or bad machining. Now, if you remember, about a month ago, we did a video on my friend Dan from D&D Speed Shop. He wiped out a cam in a big block Chevy. And one of the things he showed in his video was a stripe across the face of the lifter that was left by the cam lobe. And that told me everything I needed to know. That there wasn't sufficient either crown in the lifter or taper on the lobe to keep that lifter spinning. And so he took this thing apart. He stopped this engine. He stopped the engine. It had already wiped out one lifter, and he was now going through the rest of the engine and found a couple of different lifters had different amounts of wear to them. But this one that we featured in that video was a very clearly defined skid mark across the bottom of the lifter that matched the lobe. And it was even from side to side, which told me that there's no taper ground into the lobe of the camshaft. And we did a video on this, and we did a video on how to check for taper. So my Vintage Iron does this video, and he covers all of this stuff, and this was the same conclusion that he came to. After testing each of these cams, each of the lifters, some good and some that failed, he found that the metal was on point, or as close to on point as you're going to get. It wasn't a full metallurgical breakdown, but it was a test of the hardness. And there is a difference between the metallurgy and hardness. The two are not necessarily the same thing, but generally speaking, you can assume that if a metal is hard enough, the metallurgy is going to be close enough that it'll last. So we can now more or less take the myth of soft camshafts and soft lifters off the table. That's not what it is. It's machining. So they checked all of these different cams and all of these different lifters for taper and for crown. And they found that there was inconsistencies, and some of them had no taper, no crown. What a surprise. This is exactly what I was speculating towards, and thankfully he confirmed this. With that, I think we can now safely assume that if we're going to put a cam, if we're going to rebuild an engine, or we're just going to do a cam swap with a flat topic cam, we can safely assume now that it's necessary to crack open a micrometer and check each of the lobes, and also check each of the lifters for a crown. And we did show how to do that in previous videos. So as far as My Vintage Iron goes, very informative channel, really down-to-earth guy, very, very knowledgeable, and I would definitely recommend you watch his video and go like and subscribe and do all that other stuff. He deserves the views. He's a good YouTuber. So I bring up the second part I helped a friend of mine do his 318, and he bought a brand new Hughes cam. So I'm going to mention, because there's no failure involved in this, and actually I'm pretty impressed by what I found. So Hughes, they specialize in Chrysler camshafts, and they have like a no flat cam guarantee. As long as you follow their braking procedure, it's not going to go flat. Okay. But what I did was I checked each lobe on the camshaft, and we checked each of the lifters. And what I found was that each of the lobes was ground with a 3/1000th of an inch taper. And you can only do that with a mic. I guess you could do it with a digital caliper. But we mic'd each lobe and found that each one had a 3/1000th of an inch taper from one side to the other. And the lifters had a very pronounced crown. I don't have a measurement for the amount of crown that was in there. And measuring crown is kind of difficult. But by putting the lifters end to end and then laying a straight edge across them, they each had a very pronounced crown. So, barring any defects in the lifter bore, barring too heavy a valve spring, the wrong oil, barring any of those factors, that cam and lifter set is going to function exactly the way it should. And this is not a commercial for Hughes. Hughes does not, they don't even know who I don't think they know who I am. They don't give me anything. My friend paid full price for what he did. Didn't even tell him it was coming here. So this was a random off-the-shelf cam and lifter set from Hughes that we checked. I can't say that all of them are going to be like that, but the one we checked was good. So here's the thing. You put the cam in the engine, and it goes bad. It goes bad on the break-in, or it goes bad 100 miles down the road, but it goes bad. And right away, you want satisfaction from the person you bought it from, whether it was Jag or Summit, or if you went direct to the cam grinder. You want some kind of satisfaction from it. You're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. If you do, it's going to be after a very long, very prolonged, very drawn-out process. And as My Vintage Iron pointed out, I believe it was him that pointed out in the video, it took him like a year to get any type of reaction from the cam grinder, or satisfaction from the cam grinder on one of them that went bad. So here's what you need to do. If you're going to do a cam and lifter swap, before you put it in the engine, before you lube it, before you do anything else, check the lobes. Make sure that you've got at least 2/1000ths or 3/1000ths of an inch taper on the lobe. Because without that, the lifter's not going to spin and it's just going to wear. Now, after the damage is done, after you've wiped out this cam manufacturer doesn't really want to hear it. Oh, was it because you didn't use the right oil, you didn't do the right braking procedure, you didn't do this, you didn't do that? There'll be 1,010 excuses why they shouldn't warranty this cam. But if you, before it goes into the engine, you make your measurements and you determine that there isn't sufficient lobe taper to it, that's the time to return it as a defect and tell them exactly what you found. You're far, far, far more likely to get satisfaction in the form of a replacement cam and lifters. You may have to eat shipping. I don't know. I'm sure each of these companies has its own method of doing things. But the time to check it is before it goes in the engine. Do not attempt to put a new cam and new lifter set in an engine without first measuring everything. And like I said, my vintage iron confirmed my suspicions, and that's what it is. It's poor machining practices, sloppy machining practices, non-existent machining practices. I mean, I don't even know. And no quality control. Nobody's taken the time to grab these cams as they come off the line and do the measurements to make sure that they're up to snuff. So go with that. My vintage iron 7512. Go there, subscribe. It's great. There are a couple of points that, towards not talking about the actual cams or what he found with the cams, he makes a couple of points that I kind of disagree with when it comes to oils and stuff, and that's a completely different video. And also, yeah, and he did the same thing I did, right? He was like, I've had enough with flat tappets. Everything is going to get a roller from this point forward. And that may work for him in his business and what he does. It may work for him, but for us, for a lot of us, it's not even the cost. Okay, so save up and buy the more expensive roller stuff. But sometimes the part's just not available. If you're going to do, let's say, for me, it's a slant 6 Chrysler. There's no roller stuff available for a slant 6 Chrysler. You're flat tap it all the way. So it's not always practical. If you can go with a roller, yeah, go with a roller. But I go with a solid roller because there have been hydraulic issues and we had this ourselves, with hydraulic lifters pumping down the hydraulic rollers. So a solid roller is the most foolproof way to go about doing this. But do your homework. Leave no stone unturned. Check everything, and you should be okay. And like I said, as far as the oil, he and I disagree a little bit on some, and I'm not saying I'm right, I'm not saying he's wrong. We just agree a little bit on some of the concepts when it comes to oil. And like I said, we'll do that in another video. So that's it, guys. I'm not beating this topic to death. This is important. This is something that people are just absolutely afraid to dig into their engines and do a rebuild with fresh cam and lifters and all that, because there's been such horror stories. Oh, and one other thing I got to tag on here. It has to do with history, because we've been doing a lot of history videos lately. Around 1982, 1983, 84, in that range, Chevrolet had a problem with cams going flat, the 305s and the 350 Chevys. And this was an epidemic. And at that time, the problem was traced to a run of soft camshafts. There was no question that was what was wrong with those. And they were eating them like every single one of these. For a period of time, I was working for a lot of used car dealers, would bring me cars to the shops, and I was doing, constant small block Chevy cam and lifter swaps because of this factory defect. And that was definitely traced by Chevrolet's own, General Motors' own, admission. This was a run of soft cams, and they warranted a lot of them. But it was a mess. It was a mess. You guys, you old timers, if you remember the 1980s, everything was a small block Chevy cam job. So that's it, guys. I hope you got something out of that. Go subscribe to my vintage 7512, and I'll see you tomorrow.